Hello and welcome to Chapter 22, Section 1. And in this lecture, I'm going to be going over the cross-cultural interactions and the exchanges that take place in the first section of the chapter. So to give you an overview of what this whole chapter is about, cross-cultural networks linked Europe and Asia between the years 1000 and 1500. And there was a period of interruption when the Mongols conquered in the 1300s. It disrupted the commerce along the Silk Road, but eventually trade is restored and it's strengthened. And it's going to grow significantly. There's going to be an exchange of crops, of technologies, and ideas, and that's going to be covered in Section 1. Then we're going to study in Section 2 how the spread of the bubonic plague ravages much of Eurasia. Some of the common elements that we see in cross-cultural networks, and we're going to talk about in this lecture, are how these networks were used for diplomacy, right, between states that are sending envoys to each other, how they are used by religion to spread. We see both that with Islam and with Christianity. We're going to see cultural diffusion, which is the spread of new ideas, new crops, new technologies, and how all of these are going to transform the Western societies. And then at the end of this chapter, we're going to begin to see the beginnings of European exploration. As Europeans are more engaged in trade by the 1400s, they're going to try to bypass Muslim-controlled trade routes by mounting expeditions to India around the Cape of Good Hope. And that's going to set up the next era, the next topic that we're going to study. So this chapter marks the end of the first two units, which cover the time period of 1200 to 1450. And after 1450, the world is going to enter a period of really significant change. And so that's why we're going to start to study a new unit. So this will be the last chapter for this particular time period. And what we're seeing is it's bringing together what we've already seen in different chapters. So it's connecting all these societies that we've studied towards the end of the period. And so in section 1 is about the long distance travel and the trade that takes place. And you can see this map, it's also in your book. And this map just shows you the extent of the Mongol Empire in orange, right, which was the largest land-based empire ever built. And then we're going to see on here the trade routes taken by the travelers Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, two of the travelers it's going to talk about in this section. So one of the things that is discussed in this section are the patterns of trade and what begins to happen. So like I mentioned earlier, the Silk Roads had been thriving and the Indian Ocean trade had been thriving. But in the 1300s, the Mongol conquest disrupted trade, okay, as they conquered China and the Abbasid. But after the Mongols established control, after they conquered, and then they began to politically control the Ilkhanate of Persia, the Yuan dynasty, trade is actually going to grow. It's going to be a lot safer because merchants are going to be protected by Mongol rule. So the patterns that emerge is what we see is the luxury goods are going to travel overland through the Silk Roads. Goods that are coming from China or from the Islamic world and going across the Silk Roads had to be worth a lot of money, but they had to be light. So things like silk, right, which sells for a lot in its weight, makes it worth traveling. Bulkier goods and commodities traveled by sea on ships, like you see in this picture. So for example, spices traveled on ships because spices are big, heavy sacks. Once you fill them up, to the top, they're not easily carried over land, so they have to be carried on a boat that could float with this. And what we begin to see, like we've studied before, is the development of trade cities and ports that grew rapidly because of this trade. And one of those examples that you should know is the city of Malacca in Southeast Asia, near modern-day Singapore. It was orderly, it was strategic because going through the Strait of Malacca saves you a lot of navigation time instead of having to go all around the Indonesian islands. So it provides a shortcut between China and India. And they charged reasonable custom fees. So the ships that were going through there, yeah, they had to pay the Kingdom of Malacca to use that water passage, but the fee wasn't unreasonable. It made it very profitable to still go through this port. And so again, the Mongols are going to disrupt this, but then once the Mongols reconnect the trade, you're going to see this grow even more. Now, after the collapse of the Mongol Empire, so after the mid 1300s, and because of the bubonic plague, we're going to see a decline in trade. When the Mongols collapse, you'll see these trade routes decline, but you're going to see trade that was going overland on the Silk Roads is going to shift. So the Indian Ocean trade in the next period we study will actually be bigger than what we studied in this chapter. And so now with all of this exchange, we begin to see individuals now making really, really long journeys, and we're learning more about the world at this time because of individuals who traveled long distance and wrote about it. And one of those was Marco Polo, who lived between 1253 and 1324. He was a Venetian traveler who, at the age of 17, went with his dad and his uncle on a trade expedition to China. And it said there that he was, the Mongol Khan, Kublai Khan, took a liking to him because of his storytelling abilities. So he ends up serving in the court of Kublai Khan for about 17 years. He lives in China. He's used as a diplomat, as a merchant. And then in the late 1280s, he returns. He begins to head back, and he stops in India and on the Arabian Peninsula, a lot of lands on the way back home to Venice. And he finally lands in Venice in 1295, but there's a civil war going on between the Venetians and the Genoans, and he is a casualty of war. He gets arrested as a prisoner of war. And the reason we know about his tales and why historians are also skeptical about his stories is because while he's in jail, because he is a good storyteller, right? He's telling stories to the prisoners about his travels and what he's seen in China. And one of those prisoners was a writer, Rusticiano. So Rusticiano writes Marco Polo's narrative. And so the book that gets sold is actually not written by Marco Polo, it's written by Rusticiano. And it was the travels of Marco Polo. And that narrative inspires European merchants because they're reading this book and they're reading about the gems and the spices and the precious metals. And all the riches he's seen in these lands inspires more European merchants to seek out that trade. So there's a lot of doubt in terms of how accurate a lot of Marco Polo's stories are, but there is stuff in his book that you wouldn't know if he hadn't traveled there. So there's also some validity to that. Now, another example of a long distance traveler was Rabban Sauma. We'll talk about him in a little bit, but there was also travel besides for trade, for political and diplomatic reasons. So diplomacy is when empires seek to negotiate with each other, resolve disputes peacefully by sending envoys to each other and kind of establishing relations. And we read about these when we read about the Mongols back in chapter 18, and we read those documents for the DBQ. We read about the exchange between Pope Innocent IV and the Khan. So that was the attempt by the Christians to establish and Christianize the Mongols, and that didn't work well. But later on, as the Ilkhan of Persia is trying to conquer other Muslim states, he does seek an alliance with the popes, and he meets with the kings and tries to set an alliance. And he sends an envoy named Rabban Sauma to meet with them. So Sauma travels from the Turkish lands, the Ilkhanate of Persia. He goes to China. He goes to Europe. He meets the kings of France. He meets the Pope, the King of England. And he's trying to establish an alliance against the Muslim empires, but the alliance never develops. And the Khan that comes after the Khan that sent him, the leader of the Ilkhan of Persia, ends up converting to Islam, so he no longer needs this alliance. But still, his voyages show us that there was other reasons for travel besides just trade. And then one of the most famous and significant of the travelers was the Muslim scholar Ibn Battuta. And he was a Moroccan scholar, so he comes from North Africa, and he serves as Qadi, or like a judge and advisor to the Sultan of Delhi in India. He served on the islands of Maldives. He travels to East and West Africa. In your textbook, there's a source from the past, and you should read that, and you could see how Ibn Battuta, who is more influenced by the more traditional Arab style of Islam, how he judges the people of sub-Saharan Africa when he sees, like in Mali, how people are dressed, or the different ways people follow Islam isn't what he's familiar with. So you could kind of see the way Islam spreads differently in different lands by reading that document that's in the book. So he consults Muslim rulers throughout the lands, and that was his purpose of travel. So he also manages to, go to India, go to China, go throughout the Arabian world, along the east coast of the Swahili city-states. So he's another good source of information from this time period because and we read a document from him in the past. We read about how he landed and how they treated him as a merchant, if you recall back when we studied the Swahili city-states. So here you could see the maps comparing the travels of Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, but they had different timelines, so they wouldn't have come across each other. Another reason for travel was to spread religion. So in chapter 14, we read about the Sufi missionaries, right? Sufis would go to lands that were conquered by Muslims, and lands where Muslims would establish diplomatic and diasporic communities. And Sufis were the ones who were more mystic, who did not try to force all of the Sharia and all of the strict protocols that were outlined in the Quran on the lands they conquered. They allowed them to continue to worship their deities as manifestations of Allah. So they weren't as strict with their interpretation of Islam, and that's what allows Islam to spread into lands in Southeast Asia, into East and West Africa. And then you had mission Christianaries going to Eastern Europe. And the most significant one that you read about in the book was John of Montecorvino, who was sent to China. He was a Franciscan, and he went initially to serve the Christians who were living out there, who were there, the merchants that had established diasporic communities, but he also sought to convert the Chinese. And Christianity is not going to have a big impact on East Asia for a couple of reasons. One is too far for the resources that the Pope had at the time, for the money that they were using to build churches, to serve communities. All that money was being focused more on Western Europe and the areas closer to Western Europe, like Scandinavia, like Ireland, like Eastern Europe. But another reason was that China and Japan and a lot of, and India, they already had very well established elaborate religions. And if you think of in China, they adopted Buddhist practice. They had Confucianism and Taoism, which were more like philosophies. And they are used to being able to take beliefs and either blend them or take elements of one belief and an element of a different belief and kind of have practice spirituality in different forms. Christianity is a religion that asks for exclusivity. Christianity is a religion that says you have to believe in this God and you cannot believe in others. You cannot have elements of other religions. So it's an exclusive faith, they call it. And so because it's exclusive, that turns off a lot of the people in China and the people in India who are used to having multiple deities or multiple belief systems. And so that was the other reason why it didn't succeed. Another effect of this is going to be the cross-cultural exchange that takes place. And on Wednesday, you're going to be working on practicing writing. So this is going to help you, if you understand this section, it's going to help you with the writing prompt that you're going to have on Wednesday. So the cultural exchanges included science, ideas, art, and music. When we talked about the Crusades, we talked about how in this trying to spread and create a Christian kingdom in the Middle East, the Christians there started interacting with the Muslims, and some people started interacting with Muslim scholars, asking about the ideas, being reintroduced to the Greco-Roman texts of Aristotle and Plato and those guys, right? So we see ideas being exchanged that way. We see European troubadours who are going down to Spain, learning the poetry and the songs that are being practiced in Islamic courts and are creating songs and poetry for courtly literature in Europe, influenced by this Islamic culture. We see European scientists wanting to learn, going to the lands that were Muslim, like southern Spain and southern Italy, like in Sicily, and investigating what the Muslims had been studying about the stars or about the planet or about mathematics, as well as the Jewish scientists. So the Muslim and Jewish scientists had been more advanced in science than the European world of the Middle Ages. So if you were European and you wanted to kind of read up on the latest developments in the world of science or astronomy, you had to go to read Islamic texts, and a lot of them then get translated into Latin. There was also centers of learning in North and West Africa that Europeans would get knowledge from. And so the interaction of culture, and because of trade and because of diplomacy and because of travel and everything we've talked about, we're going to see a flourishing of culture and a spread of ideas. And these new technologies are going to become game changing. They're going to change the world. And the next era that we study, the period of 1450 to 1750, is going to be shaped by the fact that these technologies were invented. And one of those technologies was the magnetic compass that had been invented in China, and then through the interaction of sailors and merchants along the trade routes get introduced into with the Arab sailors that are traveling throughout the Indian Ocean. The Arab sailors introduce the technology into the Mediterranean Sea, where the European navigators are being influenced by this technology. And the magnetic compass is going to be a game changer because this allows sailors to travel into the deep, wide ocean. They don't have to stay navigating the coastline, and they don't have to stay inside of land, because now the magnetic compass will give them the direction. And when you combine it with the other tools they already had, like the astrolabe and the sextant and the cross staff, they are now able to create charts where they can go out into the middle of the ocean and still find their way back home. And so that type of willingness to go out into the middle of the ocean is going to lead to the voyages of exploration that we're going to talk about later at the end of this chapter and in the next chapter. The movement of people also created the diffusion of crops. And again, some of these crops are going to become game-changing crops. So mostly because Muslims spread along a horizontal axis, they established a long empire that extends, not empire, but a series of empires extending east to west, where the latitude doesn't change. They introduce different types of crops from one region into a new region. So they diffuse citrus fruits, rice. They introduced rice that came from Asia into Europe. They cotton from India into sub-Saharan Africa. And then sugarcane is going to be spread throughout the Mediterranean. And then during the Crusades, it's going to be introduced to Europe. The human body likes to satisfy its caloric intake as easily as possible. So as humans, we have a natural addiction to sugar, because sugar gives us instant energy compared to other foods that take longer for our body to break down and process. That's why we like sweet things, because our body's getting the calories it needs. And so sugar is going to be a game changer, because in order to plant and cultivate sugar, it's going to require these plantations, and it's going to require an intense labor. And they were using slave labor. They were bringing slaves across from sub-Saharan Africa north into the islands of the Mediterranean, and then later on into the islands off the coast of the Atlantic. And this is going to be the roots of the slave trade. And then the roots of the slave trade are also going to be the roots of the development of modern racism. And then the last technology that's going to be a game changer is going to be gunpowder. And gunpowder emerges in the 13th century in China, when Mongol armies encounter the Chinese and they encounter Chinese military engineers. They begin to adopt the use of gunpowder into their weapons, even as early as the early 1200s with Genghis Khan's army. As they begin to use this in war, the people that are conquering are seeing these weapons. They're like, okay, what's that? And they try to figure out how to make it, or they get a hold of the technology, and now the technology spread to the Islamic world. Your book says that probably through the conquest of Russia and the Mongol presence in Russia, they also introduced gunpowder into Europe. So Europeans are starting to explore with the use of gunpowder. And one of the first events, when we get to the next unit, one of the first significant events that begins to change the course of world history is going to be the conquest of the city of Constantinople in 1453. And the reason that conquest was made possible was because of gunpowder. So even though these early gunpowder weapons were not accurate, they were good at blowing holes in defensive walls. So now cities that had walls no longer have a purpose for walls, because now gunpowder has come in and it's changed the game. Okay, so that's it for this section. In the next section, I'll be going over section 2, and we'll be looking at some of the examples of Renaissance art and architecture as well. So I'll see you at the next lecture.